Did you ever talk about that, the time metaphors, which is a big element of Wally's book?
Yeah, yeah, it is. Well, you see, because I was, you know, like on the tour, for example, that was a very practical situation. Frank was not at all given to sitting around philosophizing. We did an interview, and somebody like yourself came along and asked him an intelligent question, and he might have gotten going on it. But as far as talking to me about it, he didn't sit around and, you know, expound on that. But I did get lots of firsthand evidence that he thought about time constantly because of the way he was just very conscious of every second and what he was doing with it. It was, in a sense, just like being efficient with time.
Yeah.
But I began to realize that time meant everything to him. And unlike somebody who...
And do you mean time as rhythm in music, or...
Yeah. Time was obviously the pulse that drove him, you know, if he...
Timing.
Timing, you know, yeah, it was like a timing belt or a timing chain that kind of made him do certain things at certain times, you know. It just was the driving force in his whole perception of everything. And I realized that because we had some interesting, almost like psychic experiences on stage where it would, like, he'd play a solo and I'd play a solo. At one of these occasions, the first time it happened, it scared the hell out of me. We, you know, he had the first solo spot, I had the first solo spot, and then he came in after. He had the second one. And right at the end, for some reason, my fingers started to move totally without me willing them.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, Frank was playing something. We played exactly the same 16-bar motif.
Yeah.
Just right down to like the last, and you know, there was a lot of 30-second notes in it. It was just.
But your hands did it by themselves.
My hands just went ahead and did this, and I could not figure out why this was happening. I kind of shot a look over at Frank, and he looked quite annoyed, like I pulled one off on him.
Yeah.
You know.
But you didn't ever have time to explain to him what the hell had actually happened in your mind.
You know, and afterwards I asked him, well, what did you think that was? And he says, you know, I don't know, I've never played anything like that before. And he just turned his back. He didn't want to talk about it anymore. It obviously bothered him as much as it did me. But I realized what it is his time frame, his controlling power with time was so strong that he had just sort of inadvertently sucked me right into it. I mean, he was exerting a lot of control over time with these compositions and performances, and they were all part of the larger whole. But what literally happened was it was like I got sucked into a black hole there for a second, you know, and I couldn't get out. It was really strange, and to this day I don't know what really caused that to happen.
Well, I was thinking that
you know, it's some kind of magnetism maybe.
Well, yeah, Gerry talks about Ouspensky writes that Gerry, he could make certain sounds with his voice, I assume, that would induce an orgasm in a woman. Okay, so then Ouspensky develops the octave theory. Now, there's something Gergievian about the way Frank worked with music, and I guess it's in the Uncle Meat thing where he worked music as something to manipulate people or to create environments or climates, and wouldn't that the music, because I often feel, I sort of would say I'm experiencing a UFO when I go to a Frank concert. It's a great concert. There's something other dimensional or weird going on.
Right.
And you're floating, everybody's floating, or I'm floating. And so he may have been activating what Gergy, there was the intellectual, emotional, instinctual, and sexual center. The musical environment, he started to sculpture it, so he was actually working on a very deep level of your body chemistry, and it started to make your body muscles respond to the instinctual center or something.
Right, and it's funny because literally, I mean, somebody had actually taped that performance. It was, you know, recording was made of it, and I listened to it afterwards, and we were playing note for note, just exactly. I mean, and some of these things were, I mean, the spacing was really tricky on it. It was, you know, typical Frank kind of a riff, really complicated one. And, you know, but what struck me as kind of odd was he said he had never played anything like that himself, and yet it sounded like stuff he played. So he wasn't really quite in his right mind either.
Right, the environment it started to affect on the levels of the Uncle Meat metaphor of making people's bowels.
We're all out of control.
Which in the resonating sphere with that amplified music, who knows what interesting sound.
Music, you know, music is, and Frank always said this. He says music is a very dangerous and not well understood phenomenon.
Now that's a key statement. And he said, who are the brain police? I'm still investigating sound. I want to see what it sounds like. That's the scientific attitude, the detached attitude. So it wasn't just for pleasure. He was trying to figure out what the hell sound is. I mean, Alan Watts said that he used LSD to investigate nature. He's still investigating nature. And it sounds like Frank was investigating sound, but also human artifacts.
Kind of a larger picture with sound, not just,
But there's also that process called entrainment, where when two objects are bouncing at different rates, like they've seen this with clocks, when there's a whole wall full of clocks and they're ticking at different rates, there's a certain point of time where they all start ticking together. So something happened with you and Frank where you were both on the same, you know, wavelength, vibration, whatever, and you entrained and you did the same thing at the same time.
Who talks that theory? I haven't read that recently.
Dardick and
Dardick,
a
right.
whole bunch of physicists.
Dardick, that's interesting to bring up, because Dardick, I talked to Frank about Dardick's theories in the Dead Frank interview. That comes up. And so the interesting about his, I don't know if we talked about this in the first time, about his interest in ESP. He's reluctant to talk about it, yet he does say in the United Meditations, he asks the question, is God ESP? And you're experiencing this weird thing with him. You got any, did he talk about the psychic or the ESP or something approximating that?
Not really.
Or was he always talking about it in his own metaphor?
I think that's probably what it was.
The multidimensionality?
He's too busy kind of living it unconsciously and not being aware of like how he operated in that realm. But obviously he was definitely a mind reader. I mean, Frank was the one person I've known in my life that I couldn't fool him. I couldn't put anything over on him. He could tell what I was thinking, whether I wanted him to or not. So I kind of learned to kind of avoid him at certain times because.
Yeah, he was sort of like electromagnetic, and the filaments of your mind would immediately go into his mind. Yeah,
he didn't have. There wasn't any. As strange as he was, I think part of the reason he had that sort of that aloofness, that sarcasm and stuff, was if he hadn't, I think it was a bit of a.
It was like being stoned. He had to deny what was happening, what he could perceive, and to block it.
I think it was like self-protection for him, because he would have find himself getting into really strange situations constantly with people. So he hadn't set up that barrier.
Right. Now the dwarf, Gerry reminded me to review the dwarf thing.
Reviewing the dwarf.
Look at the opening sentence on Frico. Ritual dance of the child killer. On side the second album. Ritual dance of child killer is what Rumpelstiltskin did. He would demand the firstborn. Then you have,
never thought of that. Yeah.
Right.
Interesting.
And so he would demand the firstborn, and then he would leave the town alone. And the idea was, what's his name was a secret. So if you didn't know his name, he continued to have power over the little village. Now, everybody was always in the reviews saying, we don't know what to call what Frank does. Is it jazz, rock, fusion, classical? It was always they couldn't name Frank, and so he was known for being an original.
Yeah, whatever.
They called it an original.
Yeah.
So there's the Rumpelstiltskin thing. Then he mentions Midget and Uncle Bernie's farm. Then in Lumpy Gravy, he looks like a little dwarf. And then there's during the Uncle Meat and Captain Beefheart in the Grunt People phase, there's the Electric Doll theme. Now, one thing, just to sidetrack in reference to Grunt People, one thing that was interesting on the Wally interview is he explains the word Grunt People. Like, who are the Grunt People? Well, when the detective came and said, we no longer want a training film, we want a pornographic film, pornographic audio tape, we wanted serious grunts, not two people doing it but laughing. So they had to, he and Belcher had to...
laughs out of it.
Yeah, do you remember that part?
Yeah.
And so Zappa said, these people want serious grunts. Serious grunts.
Yeah.
So Captain Beefheart, according to the newspaper article September 20th, before he gets busted, the movie's called Captain Beefheart. After the bust, I assume, it becomes Captain Beefheart and the Grunt People, because he's now dealing with the fact that he got busted over making grunt music. And I guess there's also a military metaphor, that's what American draft people are called?
Grunts, yeah.
Grunts.
Yeah.
So anyways, did you ever hear him talk about the grunt thing?
I mean, I knew that he used it as sort of a, kind of like a certain sexual connotation.
Yeah.
Like in, remember in Willie the Pimp, wanted by a grunt with a dirty chair. And I remember him just sort of like...
Well, that fits in. Porno...
cheap grunts,
Yeah, so the porno thing had serious grunts, which was audio, and then there was actual grunts. So,
grunts, actual and otherwise.
Now look at the title, Captain Beefheart and the Grunt People, and the Sex People.
Well, Beefheart, of course, everybody knows the genesis of that, so...
So you got Beefheart, who's this flasher guy, okay, and the Grunt People. Frank says at the end of one of these last interviews that he talks about, have you ever seen a couple making love, two people? He says, very ridiculous scene. And yet he's accused by Patrick Buchanan on Crossfire as instigator of the sexual revolution. And so he's a guy you think would like orgies or be involved with it or watching other people. But at the end of his life, I've never heard him say before, he says he's almost a Puritan. He says it's really ridiculous looking at people.
Well, I think that's all, you know, I think a lot of people would agree with that.
Right.
You know.
But why does he have the image of being the sexual revolution guy?
That could be misunderstanding.
Okay.
I always had a feeling with Frank is that his appetites frightened him a lot. I mean,
His own appetites.
His own appetites, you know, he had that Catholic.
I thought he pushed it,
He pushed what?
the image of being unsavory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, that's reverse psychology.
Yeah.
They were going to do it for him anyway, so he figured I'm going to go in one better and just, you know, kick out the jams, just let it rip. I mean, and I think that was how he dealt with a lot of his own funny feelings, you know, his own conflicting feelings about how he was being perceived.
But it's also
It's like an adolescent, if they, you know, they think I'm a bad motherfucker, I'll show them what a bad motherfucker I am, you know.
right.
But
So
that has something to do with what he really felt.
right, and what he really felt was symbolized by Beefheart, because there's this sort of synesthetic person who was very sensual in non-sexual ways, like an artist, and he had that detachment from what people were obsessed with.
Sure.
And in that sense, he was an alien. And what a better way to present that than Captain Beefheart. So he actually was asexual or, you know, non-sexual. You know, that's why he would signal out the grunt people and separate the hero, Captain Beefheart, away from it. So anyway, so I just wanted to remember that. I was going to bring up that, you know, hours ago. So you got Uncle Meat and the little electric doll, Rumpelstiltskin, dwarf. Then you have Dwarf Nebula and Dwarf Nebula Processional March, and then you have what's interesting is Robert the Nameland in Gregory Peccary. The Nameland. What is the name of Zappa Land? You know what I mean?
Sure. Name. I mean, obviously the thing with names with Frank, that was at the time that he was reading that Richard Burton, you know, that Egyptian tome
Right.
that Burton had translated, in which you had to know the name of everything, or you wouldn't be able to pass through, you know, out of the underworld.
So does that relate to
I'm thinking when he's saying philosopher, you know, like you're saying Robert Quentin de Nameland, he's talking about the guy who, maybe that's the place where, you know, you can find out what those names are, and he's the guy who's going to sell you the information. I always thought it was something like that.
Right, not the Rumpelstiltskin phenomenon of knowing it, of trying to name the mystery.
Isn't that kind of related, though?
Yeah.
Maybe it's the same kind of idea.
Right. So I cite that.
Yeah.
And
I think Frank just looked for incidences of that.
Right.
Places.
And then you have Camarillo Brillo. She has she's raising up a dwarf. What is it?
She was breeding a dwarf.
Yeah.
But it wasn't done yet. Yeah.
It wasn't done yet. No.
I remember that well. Yes.
And then you have Torture Never Stops. The evil little midget.
Yeah. Yeah, right. An evil little midget with a bucket and a mop.
Yeah.
Blood goes down the drain. Yep.
And then you have
Sinister midget. Excuse me.
yeah, Sinister
Midget with a bucket and a mop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then you have Be in My Video, the dwarf with the white.
Midgets dressed in white.
Yeah.
Midgenettes dressed in white. Yeah.
Right, and then the amazing thing is in this unreleased documentary with him and the Ensemble Moderne, Van Carlson filled us in on something. Have you ever heard of a Struwelpeter?
So yeah, it's
German.
some funny German story.
Yeah, fairy tale.
Little kid with soup or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember it was right.
So Van says that one day somebody from the Ensemble Moderne brought in the children's book, the fairy tale about the little girl who has long fingernails and is a wicked little girl and would do some kind of terrorism in the town, but at the same time would be beat up by the mother, tortured by the mother. So you get the torture never stops on this little Rumpelstiltskin under the control of the mother, and then it's released every now and then to like a metaphor for his band, which is a virus, you know. He controls the band and then he releases it, you know what I mean? And they don't know what name this band is, what field are they in. But so this guy brings the booklet in, and we don't know if Frank asked for it, or the German guy just intuited that motif and brought it in. But Van then was immediately ordered by Frank to run to a nearby museum that has the whole Struwelpeter art form or text or artifacts laid out in some place in the museum. And so he goes and tapes it, and we see then the woman, the matron of the curator, showing us all these little knickknacks of this little girl. And Frank wanted that. Now, so that, to me, that was an epiphany. That sort of, there it was in his last year. He was still working on this dwarf theme, or Rumpelstiltskin thing. And there was always the German element. Like, remember,
Yeah, remember the,
why
the
did he, you know, watch the Nazis run your town. That was
Mhm.
May Brelsow's expertise. Do you think that, did he ever talk to you about the Nazis or the
Mhm.
Fourth Reich or something like that? Remember you read The Arms of Krupp.
Yeah, he definitely read the Arms Script. You know, like for example, like all that German material, I asked him why, you know, that stuff was in German. He said because he figured, the whole project to him started out, he was wondering what it would be like, as a speaker of English, to go to another place and hear a whole bunch of music performed in a strange language he didn't
Right.
understand word one of. So he thought, well, let's turn the trick on English-speaking audiences and put this, say, in German. I said, well, why German? He says, well, because, you know, this is heavy business. You're talking about creation here. The only language that would be appropriate would be German.
What's creation?
You know,
Sofa?
the sofa myth,
Right,
way
yeah.
back, you know, when the universe consisted of.
So I wonder if that's an Italian-German thing. The Italians think the Germans are heavy, you know what I mean?
Well, it might be
Culture.
unconsciously. If you're Italian, you probably always felt somewhat inferior to the Germans.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, then
Especially if you're Sicilian, because you were inferior to the Italians
Yeah.
and inferior to the Germans.
so he felt that Germans were the theologians or something.
The heavy business
Yeah.
Well, that's
philosophy.
kind of usually
That's
What?
assumed. That's pretty standard.
yeah.
Okay.
People
Green
usually-
trilogy was done.
Yeah. Now,
We're running out of time. But,
Okay, what's this
Larry
group-
the Dwarf,
Larry-
Larry the
Larry the
Dwarf,
Dwarf.
and the
Larry the Dwarf.
Rumpelstiltskin house,
Oh, yeah,
and
so-
then drugs.
right, Larry the Dwarf is a key, is Zappa in Two and Motels. That's pretty obvious, right? And then you have, he says in near the end of his life that his house is in Rumpelstiltskin decor. He considered his house Rumpelstiltskin decor.
That's interesting. Yeah, it reveals something, doesn't it?
Yeah, there's something about this dwarf motif, especially when you go back, it's in the beginning, ritual dance of the child killer.
Mhm,
So we already went through this, but there's nothing on the dwarf thing you can remember.
Not really. No, I mean it just was. I kind of think. I mean, my theory, taking a stab at it, so to speak. I kind of think what it was is Frank, because he thought of himself as a mutant, the dwarf thing kind of came in handy.
Yeah.
I mean, a dwarf is an ugly little mutant, you know, and it's the way probably society made him feel at a certain point. So he was just projecting.
And the freak
And it grew from there.
yeah, the freak is the artificial self-styled image versus the hippie who's just trying to be natural.
Right, right.
And you got Alice in Wonderland mythos coming out of Jefferson Airplane in San Francisco.
Mhm.
So the LA San Francisco battle that Frank felt he was part of, or wanted to have,
Mhm.
he's a Rumpelstiltskin to counter the Alice in Wonderland.
He wasn't really trying to romanticize, though, the mutants. His idea of a mutant was somebody that society rejected, that
No,
might have
he's
been
training.
perfectly, you know, whereas obviously like there's a lot of psychedelic kind of, you know, embracing the whole idea of being different, but it was a very romantic fairy tale
Right.
kind of thing. And Frank was talking about a nightmare, you know.
Right,
He
and,
was, you know,
and how to be different in relation to the nightmare.
Right.
And
yeah.
and that's what his albums were a training. We're training.
How to empower yourself
Yeah.
if you are a mutant, here's what you need to know.
Right, and here's what mutants are like. Here's
Yeah.
the dwarfs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, now the drug theme. How many minutes we got left? 10?
If you can wait 1 second, I can check.
What's interesting with Lionel here, in the role of God on the magic sofa.
Yeah, we need to, you have a maroon sofa for
Yeah.
God.
Hey man, it's not a role. I'm God, man.
Okay. Now that's the voice of the journalist. Okay.
How come
No,
he's not
that's the
speak-
voice of
How
God.
come you're
Oh,
not
okay.
speaking German then?
But journalism
Because English is fairly similar.
well, journalism is a virtual, you know, vulgarization of the role of God, because it holds the news is what gives the community's need to know. It satisfies the community's need to know. So it's telling people what's happening. It's the weather. And Frank talks about himself as a journalist all the time. And are you aware of that?
Mhm.
Yeah.
For sure.
And Lionel is a journalist. Now you have this situation where you have this counterculture print journalist coming up.
Mhm.
And then now you have the idea that kids are finding the news in pop radio, in the Dylan and the Birds or whatever. Then Frank develops that to a science. The thing is that Frank's getting very involved with Daniel Shore and wanting to have a journalism show.
Mhm.
It's interesting that in LA that Lionel represented one kind of journalism, let's say print and verbal in left hemisphere, and Frank represented right hemisphere journalism of imagery.
Mhm.
What could you add to that dialectic, or what ideas that you remember him talking on that level about obsessing about news or about media
Well,
references?
I remember Daniel Shore being very unhappy about the book. I
Yeah,
sent him
you
a copy
hate-
of it.
you really
What?
Because
Oh, Nigey's book.
Yeah, because I'd interviewed Daniel Shore before then, and I sent him a manuscript hoping he would write
a blurb or
a
something.
blurb, and
Yeah.
he was very offended by it.
So he,
So
what
I
does
sort
that
of
mean?
lost all my respect for Daniel Shore.
Oh, he came back with a kind of a silly letter just saying, this is an irresponsible book and it shouldn't have been written and things like that. I mean,
Well, I would see in the polarity between Lionel and Frank, that Daniel Shore, he was a print guy, but he maybe was hypnotized by the fact that a pop guy liked him, and so Daniel's in between
he didn't
Frank
really
and
understand,
Lionel.
He
He didn't really understand what the whole situation there.
He did either, And I think he was kind of being a bit naive because Frank, as we know, those of us who've known Frank, Frank was, he wasn't sentimental particularly. He didn't go around befriending people unless there was some purpose to the friendship. And I think Daniel Shore wanted to think Frank was, just this wonderful guy who liked him a lot as a person. I think the truth is Frank was looking for influence in Washington, D.C.,
So on the theme, can you think of any incidents that on the news theme or journalist theme that you can say?
Yeah, because Frank, one time I asked him, because he was like, he didn't make notes, but he had an extremely retentive memory, and I noticed he was like paying really close attention to every little detail about life on the road. I said, well, why are you doing that? I was just curious, And he said, it's all reportage. I'm just taking notes on this stuff because it's going to be folklore somewhere down the line, and I'd like to be able to spew it back out in some form, he obviously visualized his life, his creative life, and his life on the road as part of a large history. And like a historian would do.
His own, a large history of his own life?
And
or
what
his time span?
His time span and what that might have to say to other people.
Did
the way
you
a
know,
historian would.
Right, did you know that he, I just remember this, I don't think I'm hallucinating, many years ago in the early 80s, he said, I am creating a time capsule that will be useful in 200 years.
Yeah,
did you ever hear him talk about that?
I didn't hear him say that specifically, but yeah, I heard him voice similar, kinds of,
The
without
project
saying,
object was to do with reportage. He was a historian
sure,
in that sense.
Oh yeah, sure. He always had that. It's like he said, it's all reportage about his songs, his lyrics.
So there he is as a journalist. But he's more historical. But you get Lionel talking about the people can't read and they don't know history. There is.
So that's a good way to put it across. If they can listen to it on a record, that is a good way for them to get information. It's just, there is a difference between obviously an informed audience reading a piece of journalism in a newspaper or a magazine, however slanted it is, because you have the opportunity to read it. You know from whence it cometh. You know the source. You can, if you have any modicum of discernment, you can read it and say, this makes sense. This doesn't make sense, or someone's got an agenda here. You have a perspective to work from. Whereas what Frank was doing, he didn't. I think a lot of the time people didn't know what the hell he was doing, much less be able to understand it and be discerning about it. So
well, that was the infiltration factor. He was not doing. He was not being what people thought he should be doing in that context.
In which case, I would have begged to differ with him. I don't think he was a journalist. He was something else.
What would you say that? What is it?
A chronicler, maybe, of
Not a journalist. He was a historian.
Yeah, a historian to a sense, because a historian can certainly bend history, any way they want to fit a program. But
okay. So then you go into the issue of drugs, which was, I guess you could say, the counterculture was between those who were into the metaphysical and the drugs and those who were into practical politics and change, and were not going to be fooled by any drug plot. Frank seems to be right in between. He's not as political like the left would like him, and he's not metaphysical and pro-drug. So, but I see Frank as contrarian.
No, well, definitely. That's a good description of it.
So that he would be anti-drugs just to bug people. And he was right to see that the drugs were, it wasn't great the way the pop culture used it, and kids got all wiped out.
Right.
So it's not bad, it's not silly on his part to be anti-drugs. He saw it more than most people, and he saw, he knew friends had died on it. But what's interesting is that in the end, he advocates a hemp agricultural product, you know what I mean, in his book.
Yeah. Although that's not the same thing as telling everybody that they should take, heroin or, it's a beneficial use.
So I don't even know if it is controversial. What did you ask me? You asked me what did
I
think?
Why did Frank? Yeah, I was just curious about your thoughts about why Frank was so anti-drugs. I mean, what was the cause? The root cause of it?
I think of Dali's statement immediately, and he was somehow a retrieval of Dali energy. Dali said, "I don't take drugs. I am drugs."
Right.
And you think of the chemical explosive and the chemical metaphor in Frank's work. He knew that media were drugs, and he often talked about his music. That he would see pop culture, popular musical changes would be dependent on the drug. And so where Marshall would say a certain medium will create a certain preference for a certain texture of music, Frank saw the medium that was the ground creating the figure of a kind of a popular trendy music the ground was a drug. So he had the Quaalude phase, and then I don't know what he said the other phase. I remember Quaalude. So he could use, he saw drugs as an important factor in society. The Brave New World Soma. So I think he was so acutely aware of what drug was controlling people, drugs were controlling. So why wouldn't he be contrarian just to make you think about it? So it was almost like not his personal opinion. He just knew that there should be a warning put out, and he did that with those little records in 1969, 70. Those little voice things to warn people off speed and that. So to me, it's not a mystery why he's anti-drugs.
No, I wasn't asking the question as though it's a mystery that needed clearing up. I just was interested in your thoughts about Frank and drugs.
Okay, so I would say, in a concise soundbite, figure ground situation. He saw that drugs the flavor of the 6-month period or 18-month period. The drug was the pill that molded the musical styles that he had to satirize. So he definitely had to point out the ground, which is drug, and a simple way to do that is be anti-drugs first. Then if you read his interviews, you see his thinkings about, he saw the rhythms of music were changed by the popularity of a certain kind of drug.
I always thought he was influenced too in his view of narcotics by Burroughs, who obviously equated drugs.
Now wait, there's something. Did he ever talk about Burroughs?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, let's hear about that.
He read, in fact, he
The
read,
Talking
read
Asshole.
to me The Talking Asshole, which is, he actually acted The Talking Asshole, which was just hilarious.
Did he read Burroughs in the late 50s when it came out, or was that a later
I think
discovery?
later, probably in the 60s.
So now Burroughs does a lot of his themes, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
He's talking
there's a
about
real
power and control of people.
See, and I think Frank kind of associated drugs with control.
Yeah.
I mean, whoever was was the source of the drugs had the control over the druggies,
I mean, you saw, well, that's what Naked Lunch is all about. So he
Yeah.
read that and he saw, well, that's what he's talking about. So
Right.
he made his homage to Burroughs by reading Talking Asshole.
Sure, yeah. And Frank, I think had a tendency, he absorbed ideas from a lot of different places. You have to admit, Cage and Zen and Burroughs and Buress and Stravinsky and a lot of other people and things.
But Burroughs took drugs.
Burroughs, but he came out the other side to say this is what it was like, and I'm not going to do it again. Now he probably did it again. But
Yeah.
he did have, I think, a good take on it. He understood, I think, the whole process of what the macrocosm of drugs was, and I think Frank was impressed by that. But
Right, so did you, besides reading you Talking Asshole, did he talk about Burroughs in any way?
he just mentioned that Burroughs because I had not read Burroughs at that point. I read Kerouac, but not Burroughs, and he said, you should at least read Naked Lunch. I remember him telling me that because he says it tells you a lot about the way society controls things and, how drugs enter into that whole equation.
So he was part of Ginsberg, a lot of these people, Ginsberg would have nothing to do with Frank, but he actually was, at least he appreciated and learned a lot from Burroughs, who was like the godfather of that beat gang.
Well, the funny thing about Frank, too, is I think the reason why probably a lot of those guys might not have felt quite comfortable with him was he hid his mysticism so well behind that cynical front, and those guys were all mystics of one sort or another.
Right. They wore their mysticism on the sleeve.
Yeah, and Frank,
being a contrarian, would hide it.
Right.
And that's the thing, is that he was into psychic stuff, but he just wanted...
He had his own way of looking at it. He had a scientific kind of view of it, which is, totally... Frank was full of contradictions, we know that.
Right, like he's talking about secular humanism, the Church of Secular Humanism. And we only have one life. Now the question is that the fact that I did an interview, if you believe it's true, that I talked to the spirit of Frank, or the ghost of Frank, do you think that's part of his ongoing project?
It's got to be. I mean, if it's only got one life and you're still talking to him, well,
No, but he said, okay, I'm going to be a composer who's got interviewed pretty quickly after he's dead, and that would then he would say, I was a mystic, The
old contrarian.
Yeah. But he does say in the interview that the thing you realized when he was dead was that everything exists. And so there was something that he wasn't aware of on a normal mystical level, which maybe he was mystical without following the dogma. And
he's a practical mystic.
Yeah,
he wasn't a dogmatic mystic. He was a practical.
He was a nature pagan. He knew he was a pagan and a sensualist. Now, have you had any dreams of Frank in the last couple of years?
Sure.
You want to give a couple or one or two? What do you see in these dreams? Just to give, okay, I'll comment after.
No, go ahead.
Just Connie and another friend have had incredible dreams the same period, the end of June, where Frank performed with his new astral orchestra.
She was telling me she heard a piece of music that he wrote, a new piece that she never heard.
Yeah, it was new kind of music.
Well, that's oddly enough, it was closer to back when he died, but I remember hearing pieces of music that he obviously had never written that I'd ever heard, but that were so, you know, faithful to his style. I wish I could have gotten a recording of them. I mean, I remember having one dream where I was sitting in the basement listening to this new composition that he was playing for me on the tape, and
he was there.
And he was sitting there in his chair where he always used to sit, smoking a cigarette and drinking coffee the way he always used to do. And it was so real that when I woke up, I was just like really shook because I could still hear the music playing in my head. It was incredible.
And that's a couple weeks after he died?
Yeah, it was like probably a month after he died. Yeah.
And that was the first one after?
That was the first one. And then I've had a whole bunch of them, you know, yeah, since. I haven't had any too many recently, but
where
for a while
he's playing music?
Yeah, some of them he was playing music, and others it was just, often it was, you know, the way dreams are, it was my way of resolving emotional stuff. I would have talks with him and feel better after the talks because we get everything out in the open and, you know, things like that.
So maybe the first dream was kind of a real zapping of you, and then that then activated your unconscious, and then the later dreams are working out your own
well, so much of,
thing with it.
for me, Frank, the way I related to Frank was sort of as an intellectual concept rather than a person a lot of the time. And I know that sounds kind of strange, but you know, obviously I had a personal relationship with him part of that time as well, but I found it was safest just to treat him as an idea.
Or as a drug?
Yeah, or as a drug.
Yeah,
his music was definitely a drug. And I think that this strange dream where I was sitting in the studio listening to the music was my way of kind of trying to back off from the emotional pain I felt that shocked me so much when he died, you know.
So you drugged yourself with his music.
Let's go back to what I understand, which is this music. I can analyze that, you know.
Okay, is there any?
Did you want to talk about dust?
Oh,
well, I think we touched on that. The fact that he was working with the invisible and the dust and the secret instructions on a Burroughs level behind the scenes, and he was trying to describe that in his music. And his music was just the content red herring, and the idea, the concept, which he could talk about in interviews, was what he's really talking about.
Remember on Uncle Meat it says these lyrics have been prepared from a random series of, you know, like, you know,
dreams and syllables,
and neuroses, blah blah blah. You know.
And in jokes among the group.
In jokes, yeah. Well, that's really typical of his work, you know. It was all like that. Yeah.
Okay, is there anything anybody wants to ask, or Monty? Lionel, got any closing remarks? Gerry, got a question? What?
God is sleeping.
Dog is sleeping.
His dog is sleeping.
His dog is sleeping. Yeah.
The dog. Jerry, is there anything we missed?
It was an ugly dog.
We got a few minutes left.
We got a few minutes. I don't know. Back to Dad or no.
Oh, let's.
Yeah.
Okay, in light of us talking for many hours here, I've learned new stuff from you. You've learned new stuff from me. What do you think? What's the new point of? What do you think of his father, or what we talked about? The dwarf, the father's theme, and the training film. Is there any crystallization of those themes, or what do you think of his father as a greater mind than people realize?
Well, I think Frank Frank spent his whole life rebelling against authority, only to become one himself. And in a sense, at a certain point, after his father died, he became more and more authoritative, you know, and more authoritarian. And I think.
And then withdrew and started watching TV, you know, in the middle 70s.
What it is, you know, he became what he most, you know, detested or whatever. You know. What was that quote, Monty?
Eventually, it's all the same. You mentioned one time we become what we hate the most.
Yeah.
Yeah, we become what we behold, or what we hate the most.
We hate the most, and I think Frank kind of moved in that direction.
But that's his private self, his concept. Oh yeah, what do you make of the central scrutinizer? Have you ever read the description of the central scrutinizer? The UFO and the automobile? It's a collage of all the images from previous albums.
Yeah.
What do you think the central scrutinizer is?
Somebody that, I mean, you know, I think it's just sort of another take on who are the brain police.
Yeah. So he was wrestling, he was frozen in '66. Conceptually, he was fitting it in. It's all one album. It's just new chapters of the same.
It's really all about two things: control and empowerment. I think he's going to boil his music down to those two things.
And to be a contrarian, he had to look like a control freak as
the
anarchy about him was happening. He had to offer them a warning about it.
Right, exactly.
But he wasn't a control freak when he didn't have to be contrarian.
He didn't. I think he, you know, probably if I can speak for Frank, I think he probably felt he didn't have much of a choice. He wasn't going to be, you know, told what to do. So therefore, he had to take control, power, responsibility. You know, not necessarily in that order. And I think I mentioned to Carolyn earlier, Frank had a tremendous sense of responsibility. I never saw anybody that took more responsibility for the scene around him than Frank did. I mean, whoever was there, you know, whatever they needed, he felt, you know, that it was his job to provide it. And it was often kind of even, you know, in inappropriate cases, like he did with me. I mean, here I was out of left field, he didn't know me, but, you know, he zeroed in the way he did. He had that wonderful ability to just ask me a couple of questions, and I'd tell him a couple of things, and bang, he had the whole picture, and it was very accurate of who I was and what I needed. And he really did take over for a couple of years there the role of being my parents, because my parents had sort of failed at that role. And that was a strange thing for him to do. It just was very, very strange. I mean, I didn't mind, I appreciated it, but, you know, when you think about it, it was, you know, what made him want to do that? What deep intrinsic motivation did he have? It was strange.
Just stop tape for a second. I have to remember what. The fact that if you see Frank's father as creating this son that would go out into the culture and do something that his father says in the interview, I had to work to make this kid happen. I was in an earlier time, I wouldn't have the situation to do what I wanted to do as a thinker, so I created Frank to do it. He says that. Now, the close-knit family of Gail, Dweezil, and Amit and Moon, and they kind of still live at home, I'm not sure exactly, but it's almost like the control that Zappa's father had over him is passed on to the control of the kids. And so the Zappa, Mr. Vincent Zappa's agenda carries on under the family trust.
That happens with families, you know.
Now, is it particularly Italian, or just
it
all?
It can be, sure. They have a real, you know, dynastic thing, generation to generation.
Because they're successful, someone has done something?
Because they're just close, you know, it's neurotic. Jewish families were like that too a lot, but I think, you know, you find that a lot in where I've seen it is in Lionel's family, the Menuhins. There's like, the old neuroses are repeated there generation after generation, it looks like. They've been going on, some of them for like 200 years. Just incredible. I mean, you know, I think all it is when there's a very powerful head of the family type figure, like Frank's dad obviously was, like Frank was. You know, Gail, I guess, has taken over that role. She's, you know, all that's left to kind of hold the whole scene together. And she took all her cues from Frank. She learned all she knew from Frank, so she's just being Frank.
Okay.
So.
Very good.
Being Frank.
Sounds catchy. I think I should write a book. What do you think?
Now we're in the time where, and this was done in 1983, this interview.